What is the role of infrastructure in the development of any nation at all? And as Nigeria draws up her first investment policy, where is the place of trade? That question will be asked by many Nigerians, of course. So in this episode, we shall be considering trade needs, challenges and way forward for not only Nigeria, but the African continent as a whole. As always, my name is Leah Katung-Babatunde, and this is The Policy with Leah. We start off the business of the day from the trends table. The National Association of Telecommunications Subscribers (NATCOMS) has called on the Nigerian Communications Commission (NCC) to sanction any telecom operator that has already implemented the recent tariff hike, citing breach of the agreement. National President of NATCOMS, Mr. Deolu Ogbanjo, told the news agency of Nigeria that any operator enforcing the tariff increase was violating the agreement between the NCC and the Nigeria Labour Congress (NLC). Google CEO Sundar Pichai has met with President Bola Tinubu in Paris to discuss a partnership aimed at expanding AI skills in Nigeria. Pichai shared a photo on X midweek highlighting AI's potential in Nigeria and Google's commitment to fostering innovation and supporting the local tech ecosystem. The federal government of Nigeria and Afreximbank have signed the host country agreement for the 32nd Afreximbank annual meetings AAM in Abuja, Nigeria, scheduled for 23rd to 28 June 2025. Afreximbank annual meetings is one of the most anticipated gatherings on the African continent, featuring high-level policy discussions, presentations, and side events on issues pertinent to the socio-economic development of Africa, as well as business networking sessions that drive integration through trade and investment. The House of Representatives has passed the 4 tax reform bills for second reading and referred them to the Finance Committee of the House for further legislative work, including public hearing. The contentious executive bills submitted to the National Assembly were read for the very first time on the 8th of October 2024. The Accountant General of the Federation, Dr. Oluwatoyin Made, has tasked federal pay officers (FPOs) to entrench transparency, dedication, and professionalism in the conduct of their official duties. Made, during a walking visit to the Federal Pay Office in Benin, Edo State, also mandated the federal pay officers to ensure that federal ministries, departments, and agencies in the states comply with the provisions of the public financial management reform initiatives of the federal government. Now here's that conversation on trade, infrastructure linking humans, goods, and services with the markets. Trade infrastructure insufficiency is a major challenge for Nigeria and Africa. As a matter of fact, roads, railway networks, ports, and internet facilities are inadequate. While the debate on the level of the deficit is on, it is estimated that Nigeria requires over $3 trillion investment over time to get her infrastructure stock optimal. As Africa positions itself to trade with herself, what are the infrastructure needs and what are the implications before the continent? Research Professor of Law Muhammed Tawfiq Ladan and the immediate past Director General of the Institute for Advanced Legal Studies, NIALS, joins me on this conversation. It's nice to have you join me, Professor Sir.
Thank you very much, Leah. It's always good to have you actually on the program.
We'll be taking our time to look at the infrastructure challenges, the solutions, and way forward. And I'm going to shoot straight up by asking, really, the relationship between, is it development and infrastructure, or infrastructure and development?
Thank you very much. I think if we speak for Africa, naturally it includes Nigeria. And the growing needs for infrastructure development in various actually sectors of our economies at the continental, regional, and national level, with particular reference to Nigeria, is something that is very glaring. And this is because even globally, infrastructure is never sufficient for any thriving economy because of the challenges that come along actually with modernization, population explosion, migration, and then, other actually national development plan, strategies for the next 10, 15, 20 years. You need to upgrade, modernize your infrastructure, for different sectors. And so, as we speak today, according to World Economic Forum, globally, there is even a $1 trillion global infrastructure deficit gap that needs to be closed. And if you take Africa, for instance, we have needs, for energy infrastructure, transportation infrastructure, water and sanitation infrastructure, and then industrial infrastructure. And then you can also actually say that in the order of priority, when it comes to soft infrastructure, surely Africa and Nigeria needs digital infrastructure because you want to actually promote, internet broadband penetration so that citizens can have access to reliable, available, and affordable, internet, so that they can run actually their businesses, communicate, and at the same time ensure that they participate effectively, in the trade regime. So when it comes to infrastructure, it is for us in Africa and particularly in Nigeria, it's not just about meeting up the targets in a national master plan or in a national development plan or in a regional or continental treaty obligation. No, for us infrastructure is about basically connecting people and market. So transport infrastructure, for example, is about transporting goods, services, and people so that you liberalize trade and at the same time you facilitate trade, and then you boost investment opportunities, you attract investors, and then people want to see before they invest what is the environmental landscape.
Okay, Prof, can I pause you to ask this question, and it might sound rhetoric, but how did we find ourselves in a situation where that gap is refusing to close?
Yeah, I think this is a very, very good question. In my view, it is very clear that when you have a rising, debt profile, you have borrowed domestically from banks, you've borrowed actually from the international lending institutions like the World Bank, the IMF, some regional, financial institutions like the African Development Bank, Islamic Development Bank, and then International, Financing Corporation. All these actually multilateral and bilateral financial lending institutions. If you borrow left and right to finance all kinds of infrastructure, projects, and if you are unable, number one, if you are unable as a country to generate revenue to fund your projects, then obviously you must borrow to fund, the deficit and close the gap. So many a times, African countries like Nigeria, we are already boxed into a rising debt profile in the last 15 years. And some countries, debt profile is almost 70% to 80% of their GDP. So what that means actually is that you don't generate enough revenue internally to fund your own project. So you must borrow domestically from financial institutions in your country, and if that is not sufficient, then you have to also borrow from actually multilateral and bilateral lending institutions, to actually close the financing gap. The second actually reason also is that we don't provide for adequate budgetary allocation, to finance, our infrastructure projects. Take, for example, we know that in Nigeria, our entire infrastructure stock is about 30% to our GDP, which means we are 40% below the World Bank benchmark for reaching 70%, benchmark. And in all these years, all the, efforts, the master plans, the strategies to improve and the success stories all put together has still not raised us. Now, what it means is that if we want to catch up and close the gap, we need a lot of investment. But when you have low revenue generation internally, you cannot provide for budgetary allocation that is sufficient to close the gap. For example, 2024 Nigeria's capital budgetary allocation, out of 14.7 trillion naira, 5% of that capital budgetary allocation was allocated actually to infrastructure. In short, hard physical and soft infrastructure, only 5% of the total capital budgetary allocation. And that is just about 1.32 trillion naira against 14.87 trillion naira. Now, that is grossly inadequate. An investment by a government that wants its economy to thrive. And the second point actually is that you look at the 2025 budget allocation, the recent one. The 4.08 trillion naira was allocated from the 14.87 2025 capital budget allocation for Nigeria. And that is also around that 5%, And the funniest thing actually with regards to 2024 allocation is that even the 5% of the 2024 capital budget allocation, do you know the budget performance rate as in 2025? The Minister of Finance said it before the National Assembly early this year, that the performance rate for capital was between 25 and 30%. And out of this performance of the capital budget, 5% of the entire capital budget is only actually what was the earmark for infrastructure development in Nigeria. Tell me 5% of 30%, what does it amount to? And what is the implication of not performing even under 2024? So you have a carryover from 2024 deficit, mounted it actually on 2025, where you have 70% non-performance. And that's why we're having supplementary, our budgetary allocation, 1, 2, 3, 4. I've even stopped counting them because I've lost count. The second reason is policy inconsistencies and poor project actual implementation. We don't believe in continuity in governance. So administration A comes in, after 4 years or 8 years, we don't continue from where actually, the other stopped. And then it all adds to the cost of that infrastructure project. Each time we review or cancel or we abandon or we reject it, or we actually think that, no, it was simply an elephant project and we are not part of it, and therefore it doesn't reflect our vision. These policy inconsistencies, poor project implementation, corruption in large-scale mega infrastructure projects, and then let's also be clear. Sometimes, we even lack the capacity to implement, and all these are contributory factors to we-getting ourselves or finding ourselves in an infrastructure deficit situation. If internally you have only 200,000 kilometers, as complex, wide, geographically speaking, as Nigeria is, and you have only covered 30% of the road, network, you have a deficit of 70%. So, which means that you need to find, viable options of financing your transport we're only talking about even transport infrastructure.
Yes.
Now, then when it comes to energy infrastructure, again, we are having a huge or significant deficit. And you can see the low or poor access to electricity. That in itself impacts on the productivity of Nigerians. It also disconnects, millions of Nigerians, away from access to internet, where they can run their business, communicate, participate in value chain activities. I mean, why must every Nigerian actually work in a public or civil service, institution? Why? I mean, people can actually use the digital technology, provided there is an adequate, reliable digital infrastructure that will, enhance internet broadband penetration.
But the prices have started going up.
Yeah. I mean, the prices may be in terms of the tariff hike, because the telecom investors are investors. They are not government. And so if they have spent 13 years without a review of the tariff, for telecom, in Nigeria, then it means we don't want them actually to thrive. Because the reality on ground is that unless actually we accept the review in the traffic hike reasonably, if government wants to provide subsidy to its citizens, that's a different matter altogether. But you can't ask, investors, there are telecom operators to be operating at a very, very optimal, actually, below optimal performance. For instance, energy infrastructure creates, a deficit for lack of access to electricity. And when the telecom operators were complaining of one thing, and that is the reason why they were asking for a tariff review, is because they are spending a lot of money, in buying generators, gas, and then petrol, and the cost of both actually petrol and gas have risen. And you want them to actually put on additional funding to expand their infrastructure facilities, especially telecom, to reach all the 774 local government areas of Nigeria. And within the local government areas, they must reach also all the rural areas of Nigeria. Where is the funding coming from when already they are operating below actually, optimal performance in terms of, their investment in the sector, and in terms of even ordinary review of the tariff rate, so that they can actually balance even the cost of non-availability or low access to electricity. So if you take one infrastructure, you can see the implication is already on the economy. It's also on the consumers. And then it's also telling the economic growth that you have to slow down. Number 3 reason is our regulatory, framework do not provide sufficient incentive for investors to stay. So if you have multiple taxation, multiple charges, take one sector, telecom infrastructure. People want to expand to all the 774 local government areas as investors. But state governments, each time they apply to invest fiber cable optics on land, leave submarine cables. Each state where that infrastructure facility is going to pass through will want to impose a levy or a charge or a form of taxation, And so instead of laying that telecom infrastructure facility through their state and through their local government areas, across all their villages, as a commitment by the private sector, and that will have also reduced the cost, of mobile services. But when the investors say we cannot move into all the 774, we can't also move to all the rural areas because the charges and the levies, multiple taxation is another key problem that the state are imposing, on us, is completely eroding, our confidence in the system. So we can't bear it. Recently, in fairness to the Ministry of Communications and Digital Economy and the regulatory agency, NCC, that's the Nigerian Communications Commission, the management have actually gone to see governors forum and visit some governors that look, don't see telecom infrastructure deployment across your state as an opportunity for you to tax and make money out of that infrastructure deployment. Rather, see the deployment of such infrastructure, as a blessing in disguise to your state that eventually your citizens and even your government can benefit from. Make a contribution to create an incentive regime so that they can confidently come through your state. Otherwise, they will bypass your state and go to another state that's more friendly and that is more actually incentive, positive, in that respect. And if you take a rail actually, it is the most undeveloped transportation, sector.
In fact, they've stolen most of the tracks in most states.
Yeah, exactly. So it's not about vandalization and theft and sabotage, of the rail tracks, but railway or rail transportation, if you like, because it's so underdeveloped in Nigeria. You can clearly see, that in terms of its contribution to the entire transport, sector, to the GDP of Nigeria, rail transport only, provides for 1%. And that is a sub-transportation sector that if we had invested in rail infrastructure and water infrastructure, the contribution to the GDP will have been more than 1% for rail. And that in itself is because of the underdeveloped and abandoned projects in the railway sector, including sabotage, theft, and vandalization of their facilities, and tools. Now, if you put together rail, water, air, and road transport infrastructure, you can see the deficit that we're having is so huge, and you need to cover that. So you need funding. One of the key problems that actually made us to find ourselves in this deficit regime is because for over 50 years, we've been relying unnecessarily on, what we call public fund to finance infrastructure for development. No country relies on public funds because public funds is about your national budgetary allocation. When you're already in deficit, you can't even implement 40-50% of your capital budget allocation, like 2024 budget, as we speak now. Then where is the public fund to finance any of the infrastructure? So you need a private sector, and you need also viable options or innovative financing regime, to augment the public funds regime. And if you don't also manage well your debt profile, you create another economic crisis, in the system.
Before I let you off the hook, if you've been around both locally and of course internationally, and you've seen how it's done in many regions of the world, so if you're going to speak to the peculiarities of Nigeria, what would you suggest as the way out?
One, infrastructure development is the backbone of any thriving economy. If you invest in energy infrastructure, you invest in transport infrastructure, you invest in a digital infrastructure, you are connecting people from one destination to another through movement of goods, movement of people, and movement of services. And you promote cross-border trade, and you attract cross-border investment. That's why today, infrastructure of various, components, are regarded as critical national infrastructure, that needs protection against theft, vandalization, and sabotage. The reality on ground is that even in developed economies like US, Japan, Germany, financing from the public fund is never adequate. So it is misleading for any economy to think that it can internally generate enough for infrastructure development, because there is a growing demand by different age group brackets. And it is actually worse in the case of Africa and Nigeria in particular, because we are the continent with the highest percentage of growing youth population as of today. 40%, our contribution to youth population in the world. And by 2040, we are going to actually surpass any other region in terms of youth population. So with that youth population of 1.34 billion people, 40% are youth. It means it's about digital infrastructure. That's what it means. It's also about human development capacity. That's number 2. And 3 is also about, investment in energy, because they need access to electricity. The market in the next 10-15 years is in Africa, from all the continents of the world. The second advantage for Africa, and Nigeria, inclusive, is that we are the only continent with the highest number of concentration of natural resources that are hardcore raw materials. needed even for the most current investment in electric vehicles, satellite equipment needed. They need nickel, they need lithium, and it's the only continent that we have actually in abundant supply. We don't have the capacity in terms of financial capacity. We don't have our own money and technology and human and technical capacity to invest in the exploration, exploitation, value addition chain, and then adding value to the products, then using them internally and then exporting the rest to make money. So my advice actually to African economies, Nigeria inclusive, is that because all over the world, even according to World Economic Forum, no country in the world can depend on its public fund to finance any infrastructure development. You cannot. As we speak today, China is far ahead of the US in terms of infrastructure development. If you go to places like New York or Washington DC, you can see that they are having cracks and very outdated infrastructure, facilities on ground. And now they are actually, modernizing, renovating, and upscaling them. Policy consistency is the second reason why, we must actually, ensure that we close the gap. If we don't believe in, a policy on infrastructure master plan, every 4 years we want to change. The implication actually is that investors will see us as very poor in implementing our own policies that we develop for ourselves. A master plan for 10 years, somebody comes in 4 years, we have not implemented up to six or even the 10th year before review. And an admin came in and said, well, it's not our master plan, we want to revise it. And this is one of the key problems that we must address moving forward. Administration will come and go at the federal, state, and local government. But the government of Nigeria, at the federal government of Nigeria, at the state level and local government do not go anywhere. So the master plan is for the government and people of Nigeria. And that's why when administration actually changes and annual come in, they must have this understanding that only administration has changed. And the government of Nigeria has not changed. The people of Nigeria have also not changed. So the master plan is not for administration, it's for the government and people of Nigeria. And the third point moving forward, in my view, is that we need to really explore innovative financing options. Private sector must actually be invited to come in, but they will not come in with their money without an incentive, without regulatory coherence, and without avoidable or preventable multiple taxation that are unnecessary. We also need to see that some of the viable options or innovative financing options that we have outside public funds are not only with multilateral lending institutions like World Bank and IMF. One viable option is public-private partnership, PPP, it is called. We already have a regulatory institution, ICRC in Nigeria, responsible for regulating this sector. We are already using it, but we need to use it more. Second is we need to fall back on the capital market. Capital market has a lot of bonds, and the bonds depends on what is the nature of the project that you want to capitalize on the capital market. Then you also have outside the capital market other financial options that are also viable. For instance, many countries, including Nigeria, are now opting for Islamic financing. And you can see in the last 6-7 months alone, the federal government of Nigeria and its team have gone to the Middle East several times. They have actually, brokered a number of actually, bilateral agreements, investment, in agriculture, in livestock Livestock even has an infrastructure that we are not talking about. We are talking about trade. But you can see Olam is being bought by a Saudi actually company, now. And then you can also see, investment in other agro-business value chains. So Islamic finance is about, $5.6 trillion US economy. And Nigeria has already started benefiting, in the last, 5 years, from one product, all right, sukuk. And so that is one way that we're actually moving forward. And I think this is actually why the Minister of Finance, in fairness to him, I think about 4 or 5 months ago, he reiterated that we do not have an option but to really key into the Islamic finance because its products and tools are readily available for all.
Most sincerely, thank you, Prof. Sir, for making time for this conversation, and of course, for always opening your doors when we call you.
Thank you very much. I'm always happy to be on your train.
Our education segment is next, Simplify These, and from there we take you to the food markets across the country. For more on rates from markets across the country, do well to log on to our sister website. It is www.marketnigeriatv.com. We have all the details there for you. And don't forget to send in your questions, comments, and suggestions, because we need them to help us serve you better. Send them as always through our YouTube channel. It is at Saban Media Services. Enjoy the rest of your weekend, and God bless Nigeria.